Start with prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God in heaven, we adore you. We praise you. We thank you for your every blessing. We ask you to pour out a spirit of love for your church into our hearts as we discuss parishes. We ask you to give us a share of your wisdom. Give all those who lead your church a share in your wisdom so that we may always understand your will for your people. We ask this through Our Lady as we pray. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy
Holy
Mary,
Mary,
Mother of
Mother of
God,
God,
pray
pray
for us sinners, now
now.
and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, so thank you so much for that, Father. And thank you to everyone joining us here. On behalf of the Institute of Human Ecology and the Lamp Magazine, we are excited to be talking about parishes tonight. For those of you who don't know, my name is Matthew Walther. I'm the editor of the Lamp Magazine and a media fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined tonight by Father James Bradley
Hello,
and,
hi.
and Father Max Nightingale of the Diocese of Kalamazoo.
Hello.
Tonight, instead of a kind of formal panel, what we have in mind is something more like a conversation. If you can imagine that we're just sitting around at a table, in a rectory or someone's living room talking about these things. So what I wanted to start with is kind of a provocation. I do not think that parish, in the canon law sense, the territorial sense of a parish, is a meaningful or helpful way of thinking about how Christian life should be organized in the United States. I think when you look at declining mass attendance, declining numbers of baptisms, vocations, the state of diocesan finances, realistically, we're looking at a world where there are just going to be fewer Catholics. And it's a sad thing. And of course, we pray, and all of us, according to our stations, are doing what we can to change that. But I think it is Pollyannish to pretend that we're not staring down a situation where, parishes right now, where the overwhelming number of people going to Mass are, 70 or older, where those, in 10 years are parishes where there are 0 people. I think that the parish itself has always been a poor fit for the United States. Now I think it looks like an anachronism increasingly. Once upon a time, parishes, I would say, almost made sense in the United States when you had concentrations of Catholics, recent immigrants and immigrant descended populations in major cities. But after that, suburbanization, required the creation of a bunch of new parishes in places that weren't really places, places that you drove to instead of walked to, places where the idea of something like a religious procession on an ethnic saint's feast day, would be ludicrous, because where would you be processing? Down a highway, in front of a strip mall or something. I think basically, for a lot of reasons, the consolidation of parishes, the closures and mergers, I think that's inevitable. And I think that the needs of the faithful would be better served if we acknowledge this reality, and the kind of normative model in the United States became centrally located oratories, where priests lived a common life, and the faithful were able to attend mass, once or twice a day, the one or two masses every weekday, lots of options on Sunday, confession available all the time. Because right now, if you look at what life looks like for a priest um, in a place like rural Southwest Michigan, where I and Father Nightingale live, there are priests who are responsible for two, or in some cases, are there some guys who have three?
Oh yeah, no, we definitely have priests with
Yeah,
3 parishes. Yeah.
and these churches aren't right down the street from each other. Um, how are you supposed to, be hearing confessions, for example? I mean, one of the things that always blows my mind is you see these places that confession is available for 20 minutes on Saturday. Either these are just the holiest people, you know, in the world, or um, people just aren't going. And among other things, I don't think you're going to model the importance of seeking sacramental absolution if, as a rule, it's only available for 20 minutes a week. But I could go through those kinds of examples, all day, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that. But I think really I would just turn it over to Father Bradley to talk about all the things I'm wrong about.
Well, Matthew, I think first of all, there's a lot of stuff which you get absolutely spot on in the article, and I think that's why there's a fruitful conversation to be had about it, because it gets a lot right. And I find myself in broad agreement with the thrust of your diagnosis, if not entirely won over by all of the prescriptions that you make for this particular ailment. Um, I mean, I guess that where I would want to start is the notion of the parish as such. And I know that, if I may say, I think are slightly dismissive of canon law in the article, and particularly of this notion, this canonical notion of a parish. But I think it's important to start with that because um, if we understand what the law wants a parish to be, then I think we can ask whether or not it fits and works and how it might fit and work in a particular context. So when I think about a parish, I don't kind of have any. I'm trying not to have any particular parish in mind. I'm not thinking of, St. Bridget on the Bog, Lower Snoring, or Sacred Heart, Mount Unpleasant, Delaware, or whatever it happens to be. I'm trying to think of the notion of the parish, and also not as it exists in the US or in Italy or Nigeria or Ecuador or wherever, but this kind of essential notion of a parish. I think the first thing I say is I agree with you that the parish as such is not a divinely instituted part of the hierarchical constitution of the church, right? It's not something that's dropped down from heaven, but it is, I think it's fair to say, a fairly permanent and venerable and time-tested means for providing pastoral care in the context of a diocese. And I also don't want to be the canonist who says, well, it's in canon law and therefore it's important. I want to say it's in canon law and therefore we should say, why is it there? And be cautious in challenging what the law sets out. Um, so I would want to kind of go beyond what the norm says and try and understand why it's there and why the church presents this as the kind of model for general pastoral care. Now, having said that, I want to think about this in the round and kind of in general terms. Because you deal with the American situation so particularly in your article, I think I have to kind of respond to some of this. And I've been hesitating both about saying this and also about the way I'll say it for fairly obvious reasons. So just preface all of this by saying I've spent most of my priestly life in the United States. I love it here, and I love my brother priests who serve its parishes. And I'm also constantly sort of impressed with the way that the church in America is serious, is well organized, is mission oriented, and in some places is growing. I mean, you have identified that there's a general decline. I think that's true, but there are also signs of growth, and I think particularly of the diocese in the south of the US. So all of that aside, I think that there is something particular about the circumstances here, and I think that I think it comes from the church in the United States still being a relatively young church, a relatively young church. I mean, one of the things I like to do when friends come to visit is drive them up to Baltimore and take them to see the old basilica and look at the panel that they've got with the list of all the dioceses that participated in the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884. And first of all, it's quite fun trying to work out what the Latin for these dioceses is. But secondly, there are plenty of dioceses there that don't exist anymore. And 1884 wasn't that long ago in the history of the human race and in the history of the church. So I think there's still a sense in which the church in the United States is testing and adjusting, is trying to find how it's going to be the church in the United States, and that's kind of understandable, because in any mission territory, there's always going to be a kind of ebb and flow. There's always going to be, a spurt of growth, development, and then something's going to happen and things are going to regress. So I think that kind of shifting is probably quite understandable and quite reasonable. But I think it also points to the fact that we're not at the finished product yet. Someone pointed out to me this week. I was just sort of reflecting on this with a friend, and he said, think about Los Angeles and Austin, and how LA was the massive city on the West Coast that was untouched by anything else nearby. Well, now Austin all of a sudden has become this real center. And I think that's also the case in the US more generally, that great centers and cities have they might still have very nice buildings, but they haven't necessarily retained the prominence that they had in the 1930s or so forth. So I think this
Right. I was just going to say
yeah,
one of the things I mention in passing in the piece, that calls this to mind is when the hierarchy was reconstituted in England in the 19th century. It's hilarious to compare the new dioceses that they came up with and how much more they resemble the actually existing shape and concentration of the English population. There was, in 1850, there was no Anglican diocese of Liverpool or Manchester. These great, instead of these huge teeming industrial cities, dioceses were, places like Salisbury or whatever.
yes.
And obviously it was a tactical decision in some ways, not to name not for the new dioceses, not to have the same names as their Anglican, counterparts or whatever. But it was also, and I think more importantly, a concession, a hard-headed, realistic concession to the new reality.
Yeah,
that was
I think
facing them.
yeah, I think that's. I mean, it was actually the state that said you can't name the diocese the same.
Yeah.
You can't have the same title, which is why you have the strange thing of having the Diocese of Westminster rather than the
Right.
Diocese of London, and Diocese of East Anglia rather than Norwich, and so forth. But no, I think that's right. And Newman talked about that in the second spring address. He said, we can sort of, bewail the fact that we've lost all of these great centres, but the church is where it is. And I think there's some honesty in that. But I guess I think the church in England and Wales is still kind of working out what it's going to look like as well. Perhaps it's a little bit more institutionalized than the church in the United States, because it has this early medieval inheritance, and so it's sort of got something to look back on a little bit more. Not quite as much as you might find in the French diocese or the Italian diocese and so on. But I do just get that sense that throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit, and saying, well, the parish as a model is not something that works here, is too radical a proposal. And I sympathise completely with the reasons why you say that. The merging that's going to have to go on in lots of places, and it is already going on in lots of places. small communities that can't sustain a priest, the reduced number of clergy that are available. All of those are reasons to kind of rethink all of this. But I just don't get the sense that saying that kind of setting the parish model aside and creating something else is either necessary or ultimately going to be successful, because I think the parish as a reality is important in and of itself, and not just because it's venerable, but because it ensures, for instance, that everyone who lives in the territory of the parish has someone who is responsible for them. Now, they may not know that, they may not even want it, but they do have a priest who is responsible for them. And in terms of developing congregations and growth and so forth, evangelization more generally, if you know that this is your patch, then you can plan to do stuff to evangelize the people who live there. If it's just a gathering of people, self-selecting gathering of people, however wonderful that might be in a given place, there will be lots of people who fall through the cracks. So I guess I'm not opposed to the. We can talk maybe a little bit more about your oratory model, because I don't find myself kind of like I don't find that problematic in and of itself. But I don't think that needs to happen. I don't think it needs to be an either or. I think the parish as such is not only an important institution, and I want to say something about its ecclesiology as well, the kind of ecclesiology of the parish. But I think it's an important institution and a venerable institution, and for that reason we should be careful in how we kind of try and adapt it. But it's also quite a flexible institution. You talk a lot in the piece about geographical territorial parishes, and I know that you mention personal parishes, but you want to kind of focus on the territoriality. But even territorial parishes are really quite flexible. They can be, really massive or really small. They can have one priest, or frankly, they can have 30. They can have 20 families or 20,000 families. They can have an individual pastor, or they can be governed by a group of priests in solidum. So there are other sort of what I like to call sort of parish adjacent models, mission centers and mission stations and pastoral centers and so on, which I think can derive from the parish model and point towards it as well.
So Father Nightingale is someone who actually has the care of two parishes. What do you think?
Yeah, so no, I think we're all in agreement about the problems that exist as far as like numbers, attendance, finances, all those. I think that's clear. I think I am with Father Bradley. I do think there's a reason canon law is the way it is. But I also think, what actually works. So, and I think Father Bradley's open to suggestions. If this isn't working, what would work? One thing I kept thinking as I'm reading this article is how people would respond. I just think, when I first became pastor, I moved my chair just slightly, and it was the talk of the town. And so imagine, like, we're not going to do parishes anymore, you know? And I just think of like a couple of anecdotes, as far as just like, kind of what people want, I guess, as far as priests, or at least what they think they want. I'm pastor of two parishes, so I live right here at one parish, but then about 10-minute drive that way is my other parish. And I'll still have parishioners come up to me and say, "Oh, Father, I wish we had our own priest." And I say, "Well, I'm your priest." And they're like, "Oh, but you don't live here." And so they really do see it as they just don't have a priest, even though I have pastoral care. I say the masses, I hear confessions for a solid hour over there, in addition to the few hours over here. They want their priest. And so I think that's a feature that they've, at least in their mind, is something that a real church has its own priest. And so I think that's just kind of there. The other kind of anecdote, I guess, as far as the idea of having priests live together, I do think it's in general a good idea for priests to live together. When I was still kind of discerning, kind of trying to figure out God's will for me, I visited the Norbertines, and I called my dad up and I said, "Hey, this is great. We went to mass and there were 50 priests there," and he was kind of quiet for a minute. And then he said, I I don't get why they need 50 priests in one place when we've got all these parishes that have one priest taking care of all of them. And he was really almost offended at the idea that you would have a bunch of priests in one spot when there's all this kind of need out there. And I get monastic life, I get community life. I think those are good things, but I was also sympathetic. I mean, I it wasn't hard to see where he was coming from. And so I'm always I always say I'm conservative in the most boring sense of the word. And it's that I just see the kind of danger and that happens whenever kind of a radical change is suggested. And so I do think we're all in agreement about the salvation of souls being the ultimate good here. But then we have to really think what's really going to be most helpful. And so I think canon law provides a lot of guidance on that. But then Matthew, I think we do need to be looking ahead at what are some real solutions. So
Well, maybe we should just step back for a second and talk about how we arrived at the situation where people not going to Mass regularly, or perhaps even ever, at their parish, in the canon law sense. Because that's an important thing too, is that in an offhand, euphemistic sense, people say, oh, I'm going to my parish. They mean the place where they happen to go to Mass, which may or may not be, their parish. Again, people, I'm, guilty of this myself. I refer to, the priest at the church where we have attended Mass for 7 years as our pastor. He's not, but there's a reason for that. And I think it's impossible to separate the sort of breakdown of, the the parish, especially the territorial parish, as normative from the upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, which is where the idea of, parish shopping comes from. You just have to think about this, practical layman sense, right? If at your parish, this one day, this guy starts trying to consecrate oyster crackers or something, and you say, okay, well, I've heard that the priest over here, is doing something, recognizable as Mass or whatever, or, a million small things, you hear people who say, on the other side, oh, I really like Father over here. He's so understanding, he's, people have a million taste preferences, whatever. And the reality of geographic mobility, of being able to get in the car and drive to, parishes in every, direction or whatever, kind of made that inevitable. And, you can try to police it heavily, as they do in a few dioceses, with things like baptisms. But as a practical matter, I cannot imagine, if you're thinking about it as, a father, for example, right? Thinking, well, technically, for largely abstract reasons, I should just go to Mass here at this place where I think my children are going to be really poorly formed, where it won't be edifying, for totally abstract reasons, when I could, drive 15 more minutes this way and go to a place, where, the situation would be much more solid. Obviously, lots of people agreed with me about this. And I guess I asked myself, for that reason alone, how are we going to, what would it even mean to try to change that reality? Especially because if you look at the future of the church in the United States, I do think we're looking increasingly and unfortunately at self-selected groups of enthusiasts instead of people who do it just because it's the thing that you do, right? And when you're dealing with self-selected groups of enthusiasts, they are going to go to the place where they are getting what they want or think they want, right? Um, so I don't know. I guess just what, the parish shopping thing, what would it look like to get rid of that or to alter that mindset, and would it be worth the cost?
I do think that, I mean, it's helpful to think about like where, like, I guess where it matters that we have parishes in responding to that. So for example, I don't know any priest that would say, wait, no, I know you live 30 minutes that way. You shouldn't be showing up here. I think most people, there's nothing in canon law that forbids you to cross the parish border to go to mass. I think where it comes up, at least canonically, is where there's a dispute or issue. So like let's say there's a parish on the lakeside, beautiful view. They got 100 people who want their wedding mass there. They can say, well, sorry, you don't live here, you live there. There's a priest who's willing to say your mass. Okay, so we're gonna say no. And there it is, a resource management sort of thing. But I mean, that's the kind of case where it comes into play, more practically. But
I think that's right. I think that's certainly one of the things. I mean, the other thing, just to say in response, is I'm not as worried about the people who are already going to mass. Um, you know, the parish hoppers are faithful people who have made decisions about where they're going to go to church. Um, I think that's fine. My concern is the others. It's the people who aren't yet coming to mass. It's the people who slip through the cracks. It's the people who aren't Catholic, or even have any knowledge of the faith, who have no encounter with Christ, no encounter with the church. And I think that the parish, as such, is an important model in that regard. And this, I will just say, just one little anecdote. When I was a student, the parish I was living in DC, I was looking through some drawers in the rectory one evening and found uh, um, a letter from then the Archbishop of Baltimore, because DC was in Baltimore at the time, and it was insisting on certain liturgical practices in every parish of the diocese. It said every parish will have a sung mass at 10:30 on a Sunday morning. There will be incense, and it will be at 10:30, and there will be only one evening mass in a deanery, and so on and so forth. It was very kind of prescriptive. Now, I think, Matthew, you would probably say, and I think I would probably agree with you, that the kind of uniformity in liturgical life that existed in the 1940s and 50s is simply gone. And for good or ill. I mean, I think there are pros and cons to that. But as I say, I'm not so concerned with insisting that the people who are in the pews on a Sunday morning are the residents of the territory of the parish. It's a nice ideal, and there are lots of things that are made easier by that reality. But I'm more concerned with the means of evangelization, and if no one has responsibility for the people who live in this house or live in this street or live in this neighborhood, then there's no chance of evangelization in that sense. And what you end up with are mass centers where we just wait for people to turn up and say, "Oh, I think I'd like to become a Catholic," or "I'm interested," rather than being outward looking and really kind of engaging in those neighborhoods and communities.
Yeah, I guess what I sort of think of when I think about the idea of the oratory model, first of all, is just by concentrating a bunch of priests in one location, it means that you're able to do a lot more stuff. You can have more masses, you can have more hours for confession. And I would imagine that you would also be able, in the same way, by pooling resources, to devote more attention to evangelization. As a practical matter, I think if you look at what Protestants do, I mean, this megachurch model has been hugely successful for them, because they just have constant programming. It's not just about Sundays; it's every day of the week. Small groups and Bible studies and basketball games, and the mega church, campus or whatever they call it, kind of becomes the center of the, shared social community life for these people. That seems to me obviously successful because it conforms in a way to the shape of modern American life, where people are getting in their cars and going to the place where they want to do the things that they want to do. Um, to me, you know, I don't see much evidence, nor have I ever, in my 35 years, seen much evidence that the average American parish priest is going and knocking on doors and saying, "Hey, I'm the Catholic priest in these parts. If you ever want to talk about something, feel free to stop by the rectory, and we'll have a cup of coffee and chat." I don't, I don't know that that kind of thing is taking place right now. And I don't see, I guess it's not clear to me why the oratory model would disrupt this thing that's already not happening. If anything, I would think that it would make it easier for it to happen.
Just like one thought, I guess. I don't know if you had in mind like the difference between like an urban and a rural setting. I can see an urban setting, like I mean we got at least five parishes in the city of Kalamazoo. I could see if all those priests lived in one spot and then served those people in those areas in a more organized way. That makes sense to me, at least to some extent. In rural places, I do think there would not be more time necessarily because you'd be driving. And this is true in Michigan, down where we are in Michigan to some extent, but go up to the UP where a guy's got a parish, an hour apart, and try to get guys living together. It kind of goes out the window. So I don't know if you had in mind that this is like an urban idea versus a rural or, yeah,
Yeah, I think I thought of it as being kind of in the middle space, because I think
suburban.
that, I mean, the UP is the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. For those of our viewers who aren't familiar, is actually it's where I'm from. It is extremely remote, and everything is very far away from everything. Um, but I would say that even like in rural Southwest Michigan, where Father Nightingale and I live, even rural life is effectively suburbanized. You might live in a small town of, 3,000 people or whatever, but you're going every day or every few days to, you know, a medium-sized city, to buy things or, to do this and that. Um, People drive a lot. Um, I guess I just, for me, it's almost the opposite. If you're talking about urban areas, that's where I still think the parish makes the most sense. I mean, for me, if I think about like when I lived in Washington, D.C., um, to me, the idea of a parish in a neighborhood, where you could, theoretically walk around and this area could, if you wanted to be anyway, be sort of the center of your life. To me, parishes actually make the most sense still in urban settings. It's in sort of rural and suburban America um, where I have the most questions. As far as the extremely rural areas go, I have no idea how you deal with the vocations issue there, because like you say, I mean, you know if you try to say, oh well, we're just going to merge and centrally cluster, like suddenly you're asking for people to drive an hour to go to mass, and I don't know how you deal with that.
Well, that's one of the things I was going to ask Matthew is the model, the oratory model, that you have in mind. I mean, you said that you would envisage much more stuff going on there during the week and more celebrations of mass, more hours of confessions, perhaps more adoration, all of those things, all good stuff. But how do people access that when they live at a distance and they work at a distance from that place? I guess that's the difference between the megachurch Protestant evangelical model and the Catholic model is that the megachurch model, Protestant evangelical model, you can engage in a Bible study somewhere, you can go online and for a Bible study or for worship and things like that. Because of the nature of the sacraments, that's just not possible. So how do we get that in your view, how would you bridge that?
So, I mean, I think again, that's kind of why I used the Costco chain as an example there. People go to Costco because it's convenient, because you can, you know, uh, visit the optometrist and get 4 new tires for your car,
Right.
and buy a new television that you don't need, and change your cell phone plan, and then go have a slice of pizza, you know.
Yeah, but I
Every
do. I mean, I do my Costco shop. If when I've been a Costco person, I go once every 3 or 4 months and stock up and fill the freezer. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that every day when I need to go and grab some tomatoes, I should say, to make my pasta or whatever. I couldn't drop by there for a bag of chips or a bottle of tonic or something like that, because it would be too far to do that. So how do you get into how do you make the provision more accessible for weekday stuff and more regular and frequent?
Well, I think, well, one of the things that, again, I'm maybe this is sort of elided in the piece itself, but again, if I'm assuming that what the future of American Catholicism looks like um, is a certain model of sort of enthusiastic, self-selected people. I'm to some extent, I'm just kind of projecting outward from the traits and habits of people like that. Um, Homeschooling, for example, is a huge thing. So I'm envisioning a world where, the oratory model is practical and helpful because a mother on a random Tuesday goes up there, and the high school kids do a Latin course together while she goes to confession, and the little kids go play on the playground or whatever. And then everybody catches the noon mass, and then they have they go to the cafeteria and have some lunch or something, and then go home. Um, I I acknowledge that's probably not going to be what it is for everyone, but I do think that for an enormous number of the faithful going forward, that those are the kinds of people whose needs the church will be trying to meet. Uh,
But in that scenario, nobody's working. So how do you how do you provide mass for the guy who's going on the building site at 6 a.m. or 8 a.m. or something? How do you? I mean, I guess those sorts of things that people have become used to and familiar with. I just don't see that being accessible. I can see what you mean, and I think there is some value to it. I guess my point is that I don't want to reject the parish in favor of this model. I think that they can. I think that they already do kind of exist side by side in the US, and I think that the parish model is, just to kind of bring us back to that the parish model is itself so significant and important and helpful for all the reasons we've discussed, that I wouldn't want to kind of reject that in favor of the other. And I think I'd want to see, and I guess this goes to the point that I made earlier about trying to, thinking creatively about what other um, parish adjacent structures might exist, quasi parishes, mission stations, and so on, that you might develop these things and they'd be reliant on, you can have a parish which has mission stations in it, and but there is someone clearly in charge, there is someone who has responsibility, and so forth. And you make sure then that all the people who are there are being looked after, even if they don't opt into your kind of oratory model.
Yeah,
yeah, I
one
mean,
thing.
oh, good.
Oh no, just one thing I did kind of wonder about is just how unique is America in the 21st century, say? I think it's a great country. I love it. But I also, like a few years back they had the Synod on the Amazon because the idea was that well, the Amazon's got this really unique situation, so we need to talk about how to, bring the sacraments, bring Christ to that situation. I mean, is America so unique that we should have a synod on North America and suggest, because you need something, I think, of that scope to introduce kind of a change of this nature. Yeah.
I guess I'm sort of surprised to hear that, just because unless I'm not mistaken, I feel like the various American dioceses implement, they've implemented, mergers and closures and things like that on their own initiative, according to the timeline, like how pressed they feel, basically.
Sure.
And we haven't had to, convene a synod or whatever. I feel like it's more like, I'll just make up an example, like, the Diocese of Cincinnati. Are they an archdiocese? Diocese? Cincinnati?
I think they're an archdiocese.
The Archdiocese of Cincinnati just decides, next year, from now on, we're going to have these parish clusters, these oratories or whatever, and the guys are all going to live in common. I feel like it could just happen, but I also I do just want to say that I don't think that this kind of model isn't I don't think that there's any reason that you couldn't, hold on to this or that building over here and say, okay, we still are going to have one mass a week over here. Have one of the guys drive over and do a noon mass on a holy day of obligation or whatever, so that, people who work in this area can catch that one. One thing I should just say is, if anyone has questions, feel free to send them on. I'm just looking at some. We actually have quite a few. Do you guys want to take some of these right now?
Yeah, great.
All right. We'll start at the top here. Okay. Lawson asks, I live in a suburb 25 miles north of Times Square. The traditional parish where I am works fine because in the past, not too many parishes existed in my town of 28,000, only two. The town next door had to merge parishes because there were too many built in the past. So from my experience, the parish canon does work in a mainstream suburban setting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say that I imagine that that's a fairly densely populated area, even though it's, 25 miles north of Times Square is still fairly densely populated, I would imagine.
Yeah. Dan says, our parish was merged with 7 others. Wow. 5 years ago. We just learned last week only one church, not ours, will remain after the first of the year. After Mass this Sunday, everyone was talking about shopping for a new church, not the one remaining in the parish. An oratory Costco type church would be a welcome alternative to looking for another neighborhood church, which may well close in the future. Any suggestions about how that model might begin in the diocese? I mean, that's an interesting question. Let's, put aside, for a minute, skepticism, hesitation to do this. What would that look like? If a bishop tomorrow, Bishop Crazy of the Diocese of Nowhere said, this Walther guy is onto something, I want to do this. What would that involve?
I think you suggested in the article that you would, preferably have like the biggest and nicest church would be the one that you would hopefully keep. I mean, it makes sense. Hopefully you're closing those churches, but people are still going to mass. Pittsburgh, I believe not too long ago was able to have the number of their parishes. And I think mass attendance went down at least for a while, which makes sense because a lot of people are like, well, this is my church. I'm not going to a different church. But then it did eventually go back up. So you just want to make sure there's room. But yeah, if there isn't a single church that's going to be able to accommodate that many people, then you probably have to start looking at construction on a new building. I don't know what else you could do.
In England, we used to talk about minster churches. So you'd have a big church where you had, a number of clergy living, and they would then that was probably sort of like the uber parish or the arch parish, and then you'd have all these other little parishes that were cared for by the minster. And I suppose you could kind of do that. You could have a place where the clergy live and that has, more stuff going on, but that looks after the smaller churches, insofar there are any left by the sounds of it, and make sure there's at least perhaps a Sunday Mass and Holy Day Masses in those places, or that there's things going on in them during the week. The saddest thing really is the closing of churches rather than the merging of parishes, because I mean, it's obviously there's a major financial implication to keeping a church open, but even if a church is simply a place where a group of the faithful go and pray the office or go and pray before the Blessed Sacrament, that the witness of that is much greater, obviously, than the counter witness of closing and demolishing a church, or God forbid, turning it into a nightclub or something.
Another person asks, would parish consolidations, fewer parishes with larger geographical areas, functionally serve the same role of Matthew's oratory model, more presbyteric living in common, while accomplishing the parish-based means of evangelical responsibility?
I mean, I think that's what I would envisage, that you wouldn't just lose parishes altogether. You would say, okay, these are the places that we can have the parish's life in its fullness undiminished. And then you would have centers where other things can happen that in time might develop and grow and become places that could then themselves be parishes. I think we were talking about this just beforehand, but in a sense, we want to kind of invert the model. So you've got all these big parishes, but you haven't got the small places, or you've got the small places, but you haven't got the big places. And you need to sort of think about how you can grow these communities into more stable, what look like real parishes in that sense. That's my take on it.
Yeah, one thing I have noticed, like, so we what do we call? We have collaboratives in our diocese, so
Yeah.
very kind of informal, less formal associations of parishes. And you we'll have multiple priests assigned to some of these, and yet they'll still live in their own rectories if at all possible. I don't know necessarily. I mean, sometimes the faithful just want again their own priest. I think sometimes priests are like, I'm kind of used to living by myself, so they're not really necessarily interested in the spiritual benefits of common life. Or maybe they're interested, but again, there's challenges there. But
Well, and just to pick up on that, because it is something that comes across in the article as well, is I think we have to be a little bit careful about um, assuming that secular priests want to live as regulars, or that they have the vocation to live as regulars. Living in a rectory and saying, "Hey guys, why don't we get together for a pizza on Saturday night, or have supper on Wednesday and watch a movie, or a drink after dinner, or pray compline together once a week or 2 or 3 times a week." That's one thing, kind of informally agreeing how you're going to live in a house together, but it's quite something else to kind of live according to a kind of rule, and to live a proper common life, which if you don't have the vocation to that, could be really quite uncomfortable for you and for the people with whom you live.
and this is a point, Matthew, where canon law is on your side. It does say where common life already exists, it is to be preserved. So almost like kind of giving a right to those priests who already live in common in some way, seeing it as a good for sure.
Matthew in the chat says, and I promise this is not me, just a sock puppet. My diocese has few priests, many have left, and many are depressed. Priests are also Christians who are in need of receiving priestly fraternal ministry. The oratory would provide conditions for a much healthier, holier priesthood. Concentrating priests in one location seems like it could make evangelization difficult in the short term, but could provide for much stronger evangelization in the long term. And the idea was to restructure church life to address long-term problems, right? I definitely agree, but
I have always thought, even if not all priests live together, there should be something, I mean, maybe like an oratory, but I think of like how St. Augustine lived in common with a number of priests. And if you had like a priest who was like in trouble for whatever, not like in trouble, like he's definitely done something wrong, but a priest who just needed help, needed community life,
Yeah.
needed someone looking over him, there should be a very like obvious place like, oh, well, go live with those priests for like a week or for a month or whatever you need. Pray with them, eat with them. I think, I don't know, my bishop doesn't have a lot of free time, but I think ideally, in some ways he could live with the bishop. So then the bishop could see, before him, like, okay, like this guy's ready to go back and help again, or, but I do think, it's absolutely right that it's healthy for people to live together. And so to make that happen, yeah, makes sense.
I agree with that, and I think having opportunities for priests to live together and to have common life in some way is a good and healthy thing. I completely agree with that. I guess just on the flip side, I would also say that being a priest in a small parish can also be a really wonderful thing in the sense of having close relationships with the families in a relatively small parish, and being invited over for a meal and so on and so forth in those situations. I think that the problem here is kind of clerical loneliness, and it can be helped both by more priestly fraternity in a structured and good way, and also actually the priest realizing that he can be familial in a good sense with parishioners, and that parishioners can and should say, "Hey, Father, why don't you come round for a bite to eat on Sunday night," or something like that. And it will depend on the parish, but I think that need can be met in different ways. But yeah.
well, that's one of the things I think about the kind of post-Dallas situation. This is the a certain loneliness and aloofness, I think is largely the lot of the secular clergy in the United States, and to some extent, it's the imposition of a kind of HR compliance mindset on the life of the church. Until we get away from that, which is an issue that I've also written about, I think it kind of is sort of floating around the edges of this piece. But that's another whole problem. I mean, I'll never forget. I I have a son who's intellectually disabled, and some years ago, a priest was visiting our house, having dinner, and my son, who just doesn't think about these things, jumped into his lap and was sitting there and sort of nuzzling his face into his. And the priest looked at me like, "Oh my goodness, this family right now could like ruin my priestly ministry and life in 1 second if they, decided to put the wrong spin on all of this." And I just looked and sort of smiled, and then he smiled, and then everything was fine. And 5 seconds later, my son got distracted and whizzed off the other side of the room, making ambulance noises or whatever. Um, but that kind of that's its own sort of problem. And I certainly agree with you that I think there are laity-oriented solutions to the problem of clerical loneliness, but the church has to get the insurance men and the lawyers, the secular lawyers, off its back, I think, if we're going to fix that. Looks like we've got time for one or two more. What do you think? This is an anonymous question. What do you think of the prospect of laity organizing in order to create centers of Catholic community that are not run by the diocese? For example, a Catholic coffee shop, bookstore situated directly next to a large parish that holds community events and services that can target multiple parish communities. I mean, again, this kind of follows nicely from what I was just talking about. One of the problems with the sort of virtues training mania and the compliance and all of that is if it's rigorously enforced, it destroys parish and community life. where it is already healthy. Speaking from my own experience, my children were involved in a vibrant, well-attended homeschooling co-op for years. And one very zealous, you know, uh, you know, lay person who, had these responsibilities handed to her, decided that they needed 957 different door monitors and, all these different things. Basically, following the letter of the law made this kind of, lay-led association on parish grounds impossible. So in effect, what happened is that the homeschooling co-op still exists. They just rent space from a Protestant church, and it's taking place there. That does not seem like a good thing to me, but I do think that until we are able to somehow to address, again, this kind of post-Dallas reality, I do think that unfortunately there is going to be a lot of Catholic activity that is unofficial, unsanctioned by dioceses, not subject, in any meaningful formal way to ecclesiastical authority. I'm not sure that that's a good thing, but I do think
Yeah,
it's inevitable.
yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the way that the question's posed is centers of Catholic community not run by the diocese. I think not run by the diocese is one thing, but I'm always slightly nervous about wanting to have things that are parallel to or separate from, or Catholic but not under the diocese or not under the bishop. I think these things, can really, really work very, very well indeed, and with all of the issues that we've talked about, perhaps are going to be more and more important. Intentional, groups of laity doing things like this. But I do think it's a kind of Catholic principle that they're done in collaboration with and in communication with, and coordination as well with the local parish and with the diocese and so on. So yeah, I think these are good ideas, but I think kind of otherwise you might end up with either something that's problematic or three coffee shops all on the same street because three different people will get the same idea and think it's good, rather than sort of thinking about how that can be done in a way that builds on the structures of the church.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind three successful Catholic coffee shops in my town, but no, I mean most people now looking at it, I think recognize the Dallas Charter. It was a serious response to a serious problem. And now that we've lived with it for, almost a couple decades, it'll probably get revisited to see again, like we're all agreeing, what's the ultimate mission of the church? And we want to make sure that it's helping that and not hindering it, if it to the extent it, doesn't have to. And so, no, I think that does make sense. And that, yeah, the problems Father Bradley pointed out are could be serious. There was a charismatic group in one of the parishes I was at before, and I think this was before I got there, where they almost kind of went to like a commune sort of living style, and there were just weird things that happened because they were kind of doing things outside of the kind of the view of the parish, and of course outside the view of the diocese, and so the more kind of Catholic life can get folded in. I know someone recently who wanted to start a purgatorial society within the diocese, and the first thing they did is try to contact someone like the bishop or the chancellor and just say, "Is this possible? What can I do to make this work?" And so I think that's a good whether it's necessary or not, I do think it's a good inclination to want the church to be on board with what you're doing. So,
We have so many engaged listeners here. Here's one. Jeffrey asks, oh, actually, he starts out being very kind. Thanks to everyone for their time and contributions. Matthew began by suggesting that most parishes will have to close in the near future because of the relatively small numbers of Catholics under the age of 70. The response was that this isn't possible because of canon law. But then everyone admitted that people parish shop, jump regularly, and no one seemed to have a problem with this. So other than giving due obedience to canon law, it's unclear why the territorial parish matters. The reminder to be wary of radical change and overthrowing venerable traditions and institutions is well taken, but it led on to an abstract discussion, and the point was lost that radical change is coming whether we want it or not.
So I guess I would say that the reason that we want to do it is not just because it says so in the code, but because the parish as a model presented by the code does things which are important, I would say, such as make sure that everybody is cared for, nobody goes without having a pastor, every inch of the diocese is understood to be mission territory and has someone who's responsible for the mission in that place. And also, just this is just something I was kind of trying to work in. This is as good a time as any as we kind of get to the end. That I think that the parish is also a kind of a way of the society of the church manifesting itself in the world. So, the bishop has an apostolic responsibility, and he needs to be able to do certain things as a result of that. And he's assisted in that by his clergy and by the laity. But the rubber has to hit the road. You have to be in a certain place to do that, and you have to have the structures and buildings and so on to do that. If you seed that, if you say, well, we're not going to have those local instantiations of diocesan life, then in a sense the notion of the church as a society breaks down. And that's where you go to what you were saying, Matthew, the kind of Protestant evangelical model, which is more consumerist, I think, and also perhaps more congregationalist rather than the church is here, and she's here for everybody and every culture and every place, whether or not you want it.
Yeah, and I think in general, the focus on the obligations of like clergy assigned to parishes is important. This again isn't America by any means, but there was one Holy Week where I was at a small parish in southern Italy, and the pastor had me go to every single house in the parish and bless it. There were maybe two Jehovah's Witnesses that someone said they don't want you to visit. But we went to an Anglican guy's house. We went to a few atheist houses, and they're part of the parish, so we're going there. And again, very different situation in America where it's not so homogenous in that way, but at the very least, there's a clear kind of obligation laid out and kind of some structure to where that exists. So.
Sarah asks here, her question is kind of a long one, but basically the thrust of it is, what about people who don't have cars? Sarah, I think the automobile was a disaster for all of civilization. I would, if I were dictator, I would ban cars except for like semi trucks or something, and I would invest trillions of dollars in having a advanced rail network, and fill in the cracks with bicycles and walking, and massively slow down the pace of American life so that it didn't matter. Since I'm not going to be dictator, accepting sort of suburbanization and cars and stuff, it's a concession to reality, a reality that I hate aesthetically, and which I think has had lots of bad consequences. I just don't think the car is going anywhere. If if we could change that, that would be great.
Yeah, when you mentioned the 60s and 70s as kind of the beginning of all this change, I think it has to be before that. As soon as there was a car, all of a sudden it's possible to parish shop or visit other parishes, for sure. I will say though, whereas Father Bradley goes to Costco every few months, I just go to the local shop here. I don't go that far. If I'm going out to eat, I'm going to a place I can walk to. So that's how small my little town is here. And I know there are people who have no interest on getting on any highway whatsoever. And so I do think it's important to keep them in mind. That's why again I propose that urban and rural are gonna have to look different if we're gonna look at making any kind of big change, because I do think there are people who just aren't going to go further than a few miles from their house. So,
All right. Well, we will close here with a question from Kevin. And I'm sorry to everybody we didn't get to. Thank you so much, all of you, for posing these questions. Kevin says, everyone is cared for, nobody is ignored, everyone has a pastor who cares for him. Does that describe a single actually existing parish in the entire country? I mean, my sense is no, but then that's a very high and lofty standard. Of course, that's an ideal, but nobody, especially nobody is ignored. I, that I mean, I think is true. I mean, have you, Father? I mean, if somebody called and said, "Hey, I'd like to chat or something about the faith," or, you know, is there a time I could stop by the rectory? You know, I imagine that you would ignore anyone who was interested. You
Yeah,
know,
no, there's sometimes people, ask me to come anoint them, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, Father, I know you're busy." I'm like, "Oh no, this is literally why I'm here." Like, and so I
Right.
always I hope people get the sense that that yeah, that is why I'm here. But yeah, but obviously, I mean, people can feel like they fall through the cracks. I mean, I work at the diocese about half hour from my parishes, which means that I'm not in the school every day. I'm not visiting nursing homes as often as I think uh, people in the nursing home would like, at least. And so yeah, it's it's hard to say that we're necessarily getting to everyone, even if that's where we have a mission.
Well, I think you're right to say that there's a point of access, and people can call you, and they know who they can call. And I think that's the thing that the parish offers, is it's a kind of, pretty much guaranteed that if you call your pastor and say this is the thing that I need help with, then you're going to get a response. And that, I think, is something that's worth treasuring.
well, I think the certainly we would all agree that those three things are ideals to which the church should aspire, and that we would hope, whether through continuation of the parish, the normative parish model as it exists, or whether through my Costco oratory fantasy, they will be realized in God's good time. I think we're supposed to wrap up here actually at 9, so we've run over a bit. But thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Father Bradley and Father Nightingale, and we should do something like this again soon.
Thanks, everyone.